The Nintendo Entertainment System carries a proud legacy, having revitalized the gaming industry during the 80s and set the standard business model for licensing developers around the globe. It's introduced players to some of their favorite video game characters, from Mario to Zelda. Hi, I'm Adrian with the Leaderboard, and whether you're a big Nintendo geek like me, or you're curious to know how this classic piece of technology has held us hostage for so long, we've got you covered because we're counting down 107 facts about the Nintendo Entertainment System. Let's get started. Fact number 1. The Nintendo Entertainment System has made quite the name of itself, as we all very well know. It's known in Japan as the Family Computer, or to make it short and sweet, Famicom. Number 2. The abbreviation didn't tickle everyone's interests. Hiroshi Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo, didn't like that it was similar to the Japanese abbreviation of Game Center, or Gamesen. Number 3. The wife of Masayuki Uemura, the head of the development team for the Famicom, was the one that came up with the name. She explained, if it's a domestic computer that's neither a home computer nor a personal computer, perhaps you can say it's a family computer. In Japanese, personal computer is shortened to pasokon, so why don't you nickname it to the Famicom? Number 4. The NES introduced many franchises, including Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda and Metroid, Square's Final Fantasy, Konami's Castlevania, and Capcom's Mega Man. Number 5. The system was released in July 1983 in Japan, and later in October 1985 in America. This occurred after some hesitation from the American market that Nintendo wouldn't do well, especially after the big game crash in the 1980s. Boy, were they wrong. Number 6. There were many other Nintendo television gaming systems, the most notable being the Block Kuzushi. It was designed by a young artist named Shigeru Miyamoto, and was inspired by Atari's 1976 arcade smash hit, Breakout. Number 7. Before any official name was released, the NES was codenamed the Gamecom. In 1983, it was officially declared the Family Computer, capturing the nature of the product through its simple design and usability. Number 8. The NES was designed by Masayuki Uemura, who previously worked at Sharp developing solar technology. He was eventually brought on by Nintendo to create their Beam Gun games. Number 9. Seeing how Atari was so successful with home games in America, Nintendo wanted to establish the same systems in Japan as well. After TV games 6, 15, and Breakout, they'd recognized an understanding that playing games at home on a television was very possible. Number 10. Hiroshi Yamauchi had Uemura design a console based on interchangeable cartridges. They aimed for it to have a longer life than their previous game devices. Number 11. One of the great challenges arose from Yamauchi's strict price limits on the final product. He wanted to somehow sell it at a low price, low enough for a young audience, but still make profit off the system. Number 12. Their goal performance-wise was to recreate the Donkey Kong game on a portable device and make it as close as possible to the arcade version. To make an arcade coin-op into a compact, interchangeable, and inexpensive cartridge was an incredibly insane objective. Uemura's response? Challenge accepted. Number 13. Famicom was against some pretty fierce competition at the time, and that was Game & Watch. Game & Watch was a line of handheld electronic games that was well known for their button cell batteries, which would later evolve into the original Game Boy. These devices sold like crazy, which made it difficult for Famicom to start its own established team due to so many people rushing to join the other crew. Talk about in-company competition. Number 14. The goal was to make the Famicom look and feel cool, so they instructed the team to design a device in such a way that people wouldn't judge it so harshly. The end result? Masayuki Yukawa referred to the final design of the console's exterior as a boring box. Number 15. Besides the look, Uemura focused on 7 basic specifications when designing the Famicom. For one, it didn't have a keyboard attached. Second, it distanced itself from the image of a PC. Third, it was a machine exclusively for playing games and not some child's plaything. You get the idea. Uemura kept in mind game consoles such as the American ColecoVision in an effort to appeal to viewers and their needs. Number 16. One of the other previous specifications when designing the Famicom was the possibility of joysticks. However, Uemura was concerned that joysticks would pose as a hazard for children, so the D-pad was brought to invention. Number 17. This D-pad comes with some regrets. For one, Uemura admits that Nintendo didn't license its design as it became the standard for control in games. Number 18. Clicking sounds were also a possibility, but that didn't work out either. There were concerns that if the buttons were too slow in returning to their starting position, it would alienate players from the game. Designers wanted a system that responded to quick input from players rather than having them wait awkwardly to click for a new action. Number 19. There was even talk of a microphone in the second controller, but Uemura couldn't imagine players being entertained by the sound of their own voices. Number 20. Up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A, start was popular popularized on the NES. Many players first learned of its existence in Konami's NES game, Contra, in 1988. It's also called the 30 Lives Code, or the Contra Code, or the Konami Code. Contra wasn't the first game to introduce it, but it definitely was the game that made it famous. Number 21. The NES team had their share of simple questions. One important decision was choosing colors. Which colors would be most effective when appearing on screen, and what would players respond well to? Put that dilemma into perspective the next time you want to drive down Rainbow Road. Number 22. NES graphics have been known to seem a little blocky, and they are. They're made up of 8x8 pixel blocks called tiles. The graphics system is a separate processor that only recognizes tiles, tile maps, and sprites. Number 23. The processor has its own palette memory and can show up to 25 colors at a time. It can display one background color, 4 sets of 3 tile colors, and 4 sets of 3 sprite colors. Number 24. An example of this limitation can be seen in the old Mario instruction manuals, where he wore red overalls, a blue shirt, a black mustache, and bright yellow buttons. Seems normal enough, right? Well, the Famicom's technical limitations made his hair and shirt exactly the same color. Number 25. The picture processing unit can put out pictures at a resolution of 256 by 240, but on most NTSC TVs, the top and bottom 8 pixels would get covered by overscan, making the resolution 246 by 224. Number 26. Standard sprites were often 8 pixels by 8 pixels or 8 pixels by 16 pixels, which, as we all know now, really small. Number 27. There were some tricks around those limits. For example, smaller sprites could be placed side by side to create larger meta sprites, which was actually the standard in most NES games. The mushroom sprite from Super Mario Bros. Is actually 4 8x8 sprites put together, while Mario himself is made of 4 8x16 sprites. Number 28. Looks like the designers had to get a bit creative. Individual sprites were layered to create more colors. This allowed them to make Mega Man's helmet 2 shades of blue and make his eyes a different color than his face. Number 29. The NES team needed special chips for their system, and most companies who made these chips were tied up producing them for personal computers. Ricoh, the company known for making copiers and fax machines, was the only available company in Japan that could fulfill Nintendo's request to make hundreds of thousands of systems. Number 30. Not only did Ricoh provide the right resources, they also steered Uemura to use a chip based on MOS's 6502 for the Famicom, an uncommon piece of tech. This ended up bringing Satoru Iwata, future Nintendo president, onto the Nintendo train. Iwata had taught himself programming, became an expert, and worked for the Commodore PET, where they also used the 6502 chip, and a key player in their early days. Number 31. Satoru Iwata helped Nintendo pitch the Famicom technology to Atari by programming 4 Famicom conversions of Atari arcade hits. He later stepped in to help out with early first-party titles like Balloon Fight and Pinball. Number 32. Chip shortages actually caused some problems down the road. Lots of popular games went out of print because of the lack of materials. The release for Zelda 2 kept delaying about a year in the US because they couldn't get the high-capacity battery-enabled ROMs they needed for the game. Number 33. You know those good old 8-bit tunes we really love? Well, this is where it all started. CPU and sound chips were created due to the Famicom being sold into the home market, not some noisy arcade. Number 34. The NES had 5 audio channels, 2 pulse wave channels, a triangle wave channel, a noise channel, and a sample channel. These channels were able to create slightly more complex sounds, like the bongo sounds in Super Mario Bros. 3 and the crowd cheering in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Number 35. ROM cartridges were originally supposed to match the dimensions of the audio cassette tape. However, in order to fit the circuit boards into the cartridges, they ultimately ended up a size bigger. Number 36. One feature that was made more for giggles than gadgets was the lever used to eject the ROM cartridges. It wasn't all that necessary, as it was perfectly practical to insert and remove the ROM cartridges by hand. However, Yokoi, the head of R&D, felt that children would be thrilled if they could push the lever to make the cartridges pop out of the system. Actually, I love doing that too. Number 37. The color of the console was also a subject that had its elements of fun. During their travels, Uemura and the president would point out random colors during their trip, from red billboards to scarves. That's how the system ended up with its red theme, based on Yamauchi's scarf. Number 38. Like college kids crammed into a dorm room for finals, the NES team worked like madmen perfecting the system. Most of those long hours were fueled by free udon noodles. Number 39. The launch titles for the Famicom were Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Lots of muscle there. Number 40. Ironically, Donkey Kong was originally designed as a Popeye game. They just replaced Bluto for the barrel-throwing Kong. Number 41. Shigeru Miyamoto, who created Donkey Kong, also created the opening and end music for the DK arcade version, and did a little music for the NES version too. Still keeping it fresh. Number 42. Miyamoto believes that having the new jump option in Donkey Kong is what made it appealing to many consumers. Jumping was fun and gave players a sense of physical activity. Number 43. With the initial batch of consoles, some players experienced certain games failing. The consoles ended up having a minor defect, and even though it was a less than 1% failure rate, Nintendo recalled those systems, taking a big loss. But this recall was a win in the long run because it showed consumers that Nintendo was committed to pleasing its customers, and it actually helped spark the first big batch of hardware and software sales. Number 44. These initial consoles have actually become a collector's item. You can recognize them by the square buttons on the controllers versus the round buttons most of us had. Those square buttons were changed because sometimes they would stick or fall off, so the round buttons replaced them and stuck around for good. Number 45. Horizontal scrolling was normal for the Famicom, but the real achievement was moving those horizontal lines individually and horizontally without moving the entire screen. Developers actually figured this out from some glitches in the game F-Zero, where the track shifted during gameplay. Nintendo creators didn't think it was a possibility before seeing that. Thanks, glitches. Number 46. Let's be honest, a lot of us love those errors and bugs, and some are even famous. The most famous one is the Minus World in Super Mario Bros., where players can send themselves to a secret endless level, a level that doesn't exist in the game code. Another error is the Lost Worlds of Metroid. Some people love to try completing these games in as little time as possible by using game errors as shortcuts. Number 47. Mario and Zelda were developed at the same time, which is probably why they have some similarities. Miyamoto would decide which new idea would be for which game, but sometimes there was a little crossover. For example, the fire bar was created for Zelda, but it's also seen in a ton of Super Mario Bros. And Mario's piranha plant enemies also ended up in Zelda as the nemesis known as Manhandla. Number 48. Super Mario Bros. Was supposed to be Nintendo's first and last game on the NES in North America. Say what? Remember the Famicom? Well, since it came out about 2.5 years before the American NES, they were already ready to update the technology with the Famicom disk system. Ironically, Mario Bros. Launched the NES's success in America, so it definitely was not its last work. Number 49. Nintendo originally approached Atari about releasing the Famicom in the US. It would have been called the Nintendo Advanced Video Game System. However, the deal fell through. Number 50. The AVS, or Advanced Video System, definitely had an 80s style look to it. The AVS had the same expansion abilities as the Famicom, including the keyboard, the data recorder tape cassette, and a light gun design, which later inspired the phasers in Star Trek The Next Generation. It also switched out the classic crosspad controller for a square D-pad that would later be used by Sega in its Master System. Unfortunately, the look was the only cool thing about the AVS. The hardware was pretty much the same and consumers weren't impressed. Number 51. Wanna know why they used a front-loading design on the NES? They were actually supposed to mimic VCRs, which had recently become very popular in the mid-80s. Designers wanted to make it look like those cool VHS players and not like the Atari 2600. Number 52. The Famicom technology was used to make Nintendo stand up versus arcade systems. Though Japanese players didn't like the competitiveness of it, the American consumers loved it. Number 53. Now you're playing with power was the big pitch that convinced people to go buy a new NES system on October 18, 1985, centered around the North American launch. A little over 3 decades later, it still gives gamers chills. Number 54. Since the video game industry was in a struggle and stores were hesitant to stock new consoles, Nintendo agreed to buy back unsold consoles so that the stores would not be liable. Number 55. The Nintendo Entertainment System launched at the price of $199. Today, you can purchase the classic miniature for so much less, $59.99 to be exact. Number 56. The 18 NES launch games were Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, Donkey Kong Jr. Math, Baseball, Clu Land, 10-Yard Fight, Excite Bike, Golf, Gyromite, Hogan's Alley, Ice Climber, Kung Fu, Mach Rider, Pinball, Stack Up, Tennis, Wild Gunman, and Wrecking Crew. Number 57. The first NES commercials played up the Zapper and Rob a lot more than the games themselves. I mean, who could blame them? It's a robot in the 80s. Number 58. In America, the main character in the game Kung Fu was named Thomas. In Japan, it was a licensed game called Spartan X and was based on the movie Wheels on Meals with Jackie Chan. Number 59. Before the company even began making video games, Nintendo had created a Duck Hunt toy in 1976. It projected ducks on the wall and players shot at them with the toy gun. This was modeled after a 1973 arcade game called the Laser Clay Shooting System. Number 60. Some cartridges of Gyromite and Stack Up were actually Famicom games in disguise, with Japanese to American software converters inside. Number 61. All NES cartridges are gray except Zelda, but Famicom game cartridges are all varying colors. Don't taste the rainbow, play the rainbow. Number 62. When US players first tried out the rectangle controller of the NES, they didn't know how to use it. They were used to joysticks or knobs from earlier consoles or arcades. And Uemura even once showed a funny picture of an American player holding the controller like an Atari joystick, pinching the buttons with his right hand while gripping the D-pad with his left. Someone might want to help him. Number 63. Rob, aka the robotic operating buddy, was used to make the NES seem more like an entertainment system and not a video game console, which people were still skeptical about. It definitely didn't disappoint, and is iconic even today. Number 64. Despite his adorable robotic face, Rob can actually only play 2 games, Gyromite and Stack Up. Number 65. Rob has made appearances in other video games such as Kirby's Dream Land 3, Pikmin 2, Beautiful Joe, F-Zero GX, the WarioWare series, and the Star Fox series. He's also a character you unlock in 2 of the most recent Smash Bros. Games, and Mario Kart DS. Number 66. Another retired NES tool is the the Nintendo Power Glove from 1989. It was the first motion-controlled device for a home console and had players put 3 interlinked sensors on top of the TV to make it work. I guess you can call it the Wii's great-grandfather. Number 67. Though players were able to use the Power Glove on any NES game, there were a few that were specifically designed for it, like Super Glove Ball and Bad Street Brawler. Other titles were in development for the Power Glove, but they were cancelled when the existing games flopped. Number 68. Blame for the barely intuitive controller actually goes to Mattel, which obtained the license to create, manufacture, and market the device beginning in 1990. Because Nintendo insisted the glove work with its entire library of games, Mattel found itself trying to engineer a backwards compatible accessory with little success. They predicted that they'd move 1 million gloves that year, but only 100,000 were sold, and that's not counting the returns. Number 69. The Wizard, starring Fred Savage, was essentially a 96-minute commercial for Nintendo, and its big reveal was the Power Glove. Cue screams. Number 70. The Zapper was always the real Nintendo star. The Japanese version was even cooler. It was a small black revolver and was definitely more realistic looking than the US version. But we can't deny who the real cool kids were during the 80s. Number 71. In the Wii U game Splatoon, a weapon known as the N-Zap was released. Both the N-Zap 85 and N-Zap 89 were based on the NES Zapper's design, especially the use of gray and orange colors. The N-Zap 83 was also made available as additional DLC. Number 72. The Zapper was succeeded by the Super Scope for the Super Nintendo. The Super Scope can be seen in Yoshi's Safari, which has players using the Super Scope peripheral. Number 73. Because of how the Zapper functions, it's not compatible with LCD or plasma TVs, and can only be used with older CRT TVs. Yeah, you'll know a real Nintendo fan when you see one. Number 74. The Power Pad was like an early version of the Wii Fit balance board. It had its run with 11 Japanese games and 6 US games, and closely resembled a twister mat. Number 75. In 1987, there was another popular arcade controller that came out, the NES Advantage. It was firm and had an arcade joystick, big A and B buttons, turbo buttons, and a slow motion button. That's too many buttons for me. Number 76. The NES Satellite was released in 1989. No, it didn't get more TV channels. It was a wireless adapter that made it so 4 people could play the console at the same time. It used infrared to connect the controller ports, thus generating competitive game yelling for the rest of eternity. Number 77. A year later, the NES 4-Score came out in 1990. The 4-Score was not wireless, but it did have a turbo button switch that gave rapid fire to connected controllers. Number 78. The Family Computer 3D system was released in Japan and made graphics look 3D to players. It came with 1 game and was never released in any other countries. Number 79. Now You're Knitting with Power sounds like an April Fool's prank, but it was actually something Nintendo seriously considered as an ad slogan. Former Nintendo employee Howard Phillips once posted a long-forgotten product brochure from the late 1980s on Facebook that demonstrated the company was playing with the idea of a knitting machine peripheral that could be attached to the NES. The add-on and the design cartridges were apparently met with tepid reception during an industry event and never released. Number 80. The Famicom Disk System peripheral played games from floppy disks in custom yellow plastic cases. The word Nintendo was put on every diskette as a copyright protection. Certain letter grooves were deeper than others, so when it was inserted into the drive, only the legitimate disc would fit the exact groove slots. Fraudulent discs wouldn't fit perfectly and therefore wouldn't run. Number 81. Third parties went nuts making games for Famicom. The Famicom had almost twice as many games as the NES, but most of them were pretty awful. Though the NES had some bad ones too, it didn't come close to the Famicom number of terrible games. Number 82. Because of this, Nintendo was strict in their third-party policies. The parties had to be licensed to make games for Nintendo, and the licensing terms prohibited them from making games for other consoles. The terms also limited them to making only 2 games per year for Nintendo. Number 83. To add to their licensing policies, Nintendo created the seal of quality to prevent overload of unlicensed games that the Atari 2600 and other consoles faced. Many customers misunderstood this to mean the game itself was guaranteed to be top quality. Luckily for Nintendo, the games were usually pretty good and pleased customers. Number 84. Nintendo laid down more limitations, mostly to prohibit religious or inappropriate content. These rules led to the characters in Mortal Kombat on Super Nintendo oozing sweat instead of blood. Number 85. When NES first came out, the hardware called 10NES helped the consoles avoid the low-quality software that had become a problem for Atari, but Nintendo ended up dealing with another problem. Tengen, a subsidiary of Atari Games, used Nintendo's copyright documents to reverse engineer the 10NES chip and make its own compatible version, called Rabbit. Nintendo then sued for patent infringement and won the case. Silly Rabbit, tricks are for kids. Number 86. Bandai has no record of how many copies of the game's stadium events they produced, but it was a hit with Nintendo. It was an athletic game meant to be used with the Power Pad exercise mat, and Nintendo loved it so much they licensed it and released it themselves. Number 87. Nintendo did give the beloved game a new title though. They called it World Class Track Meet. They pulled all copies of stadium events from the market, and those pulled copies now run anywhere from from $35,000 to $45,000 at auctions. Number 88. Cartridges come in two pieces, CHR-ROM and PRG-ROM. The CHR-ROM stores characters and graphical data, while the PRG-ROM stores commands and programs. Number 89. These two-piece cartridges are one of the main reasons the console lasted long. NES can support bigger games by paging between different ROM files. A game like Kirby's Adventure was way too big for the NES's built-in memory, so basically the ROMs saved the day. Number 90. Everyone after that pretty much copied this genius cartridge format to make bigger games. Later on, some publishers even made high-end cartridges for their fancy quality games, like Konami's rare VRC7 chip, which allowed more advanced music capabilities for the game Lagrange Point. Number 91. Remember how cool those TVs with built-in VCRs were? Well, in 1989, Sharp made a TV with a built-in NES. What? When players turned the console on, the channel indicator would read P to confirm that the NES was on. Way old school and way cool. Number 92. The NES 101 came out in 1993 and was a revamped version of the NES, but the design was modeled after the Super Nintendo console. It was flatter and curvier and smaller than the original. Number 93. The NES 101 also had a big red power switch on top versus the old power button in front of the original. The reset button was gray, bigger, and placed on top, and the controllers looked like the dog bone shaped Super Nintendo controllers. Number 94. If you're wondering why NES games are so hard, late Nintendo president Satoru Iwata explained the process on an episode of the Japanese show Game Center CX. During the debug process, everyone involved in the game's production would spend all night playing it, and because they make games, they become good at them. So expert gamers would make these games saying this was too easy. The result was the programmers would go back and make the games harder, based on their own skewed levels of expertise. Number 95. The Captain Nintendo Hotline was an 800-number service that provided tips, but the overwhelming number of calls forced Nintendo to convert to a 900 toll service by 1990. Game counselors could talk to kids through difficult spots, but also found themselves being asked questions about school, or, in the case of older gamers, marriage issues. The company eventually capped calls at 7 minutes to avoid inadvertent therapy sessions. Awkward. Number 96. Remember when blowing into cartridges was the very thing that helped fix them? Shigeru Miyamoto admitted to that being an official remedy. He even compared it to a malfunctioning TV. If it doesn't have that signal, whack it. However, he says if players really wanted to take care of their games, an official cleaning kit would be a good purchase. I see what you're doing there, Nintendo. Number 97. In 1990, fans across the US heard about a special Nintendo World Championship challenge. Nintendo road tripped it across the country in search of the greatest NES player ever. Though other video game challenges have popped up since then, none of them became as famous or garnered as much excitement as the Nintendo World Championships. Number 98. Over 600 games were developed for the NES and over 1,000 for the Famicom. They can't fit all of that in one GameStop, can they? Number 99. Back in the day, Nintendo was able to create a video game with only 5 to 6 people working on it. Nowadays, a team of 50 to 60 developers work on a game. Given the advancement, it's understandable. Number 100. The last game released on NES was Wario's Woods, the 8-bit adaptation of the Super Nintendo puzzler. It was released in December 1994, a week after the Sony PlayStation launched in Japan. Yep, the NES lasted that long, through 3 console generations. Number 101. The console was available in Japan until September 2003, making it the longest lasting gaming console in their history, and certainly the most memorable. Number 102. Yamauchi aimed to sell 1 million hardware units of this console, but it did way better, of course. It ended up selling 14 million in Japan alone. Number 103. By the end of its run, over 60 million NES units had been sold throughout the world. Number 104. If you think video game consoles can't win an Emmy, you're wrong. In 2007, the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences awarded the Technological and Engineering Emmy Award to Nintendo for their D-pad innovation. Yeah, D-pad! Take that, Modern Family. Number 105. While the NES in its heyday was never officially released in the Soviet Union, an unlicensed Chinese hardware clone named the Dendy was produced in Russia in the early 90s. Aesthetically, it's an exact duplicate of the original Famicom, with the color scheme and labels altered. In addition, the hardwired controllers of the original console were omitted in favor of removable controllers which connected to the front of the unit using DE9 serial connectors, identical to those used in the Atari 2600 and the Atari 8-bit family of computers. All games sold in Russia for Dendy are bootleg copies, not the original Nintendo cartridges. Number 106. Surprise, surprise! Super Mario Bros. Was the most popular game on the NES, selling over 40 million copies to date. Mamma mia! Number 107. Other bestsellers include Duck Hunt, Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Mario Bros. 2, The Legend of Zelda, Tetris, Dr. Mario, Zelda 2, Excite Bike, and Golf. Most of these hits will be pre-installed in the NES Classic Edition releasing November 11, 2016. You have completed 107 facts about the Nintendo Entertainment System and Famicom, and proved the justice of our culture. Which NES game was your favorite? Which facts were nostalgic? Are you gonna buy the NES Classic Edition? Comment below and let us know. We have new videos dropping every week, so let us know what game you want us to cover next. And if you like getting more from your games, subscribe to the Leaderboard, where we help you game smarter.